name is Martina Devlin. I'm a novelist and journalist. I'm delighted to be taking part in the 33rd Féile, Long May It Last. And today I'm going to be talking to Laurence McKeown, or should I say Dr. Laurence McKeown, who was born in Randalston, County Antrim, joined the IRA as a teenager and spent 16 years in prison after being sentenced to life in the 1970s. Now, during his imprisonment, he took part in the 1981 hunger strike at Long 40 years ago now, imagine, a hunger strike which claimed 10 lives. Laurence survived for 70 days without food. After his release in 1992, he completed a PhD at Queen's University Belfast and has written plays, screenplays and poetry dealing with this experience. Laurence, how are you doing?
Very well, Martina. Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. How did you end up in prison?
Well, really, as I was growing up, I grew up in a very mixed area, Martina, as in religions-wise. I have lovely neighbours, worked on farms with local farmers, learned to drive a tractor when I was 10, which I loved, and put a very innocent upbringing at that time. And then around 12, 13, the Civil Rights March actually came through my own area because they were stopped at Antrim, the People's Democracy March, and bused down to a small Hibernian hall beside a new house that we were building at the time. And of course I was oblivious to who these were, just seeing these people with long hair and guitars, and what I discovered later was an Afghan coat. So it's interesting to be living through that sort of period and not being aware of what was going on. And then sort of just later, I suppose, hearing the debates on the TV, people like Martina Devlin at the time, or Jerry Fitt, or people who would have been SDLP at the time. And my father was never political, family weren't political at all, but I always remember him being very animated by the talks on the TV. And I suppose what I realized in later years was that it was the first time that people were articulating on mainstream media his own experiences as a Catholic in terms of discrimination, employment and housing. And actually, where we moved it, when they're building the motorway, the M2 motorway, which now exists, it went straight through our house, excuse me, and we had to move and build a new house, and my father ran into really major difficulties there getting the planning through Antrim Council. So it's all these things to become aware of in later years. But I suppose for me, the main thing was the Ulster Defence Regiment. Was I was taking more of an interest in what was happening and starting to know some people who had been a few years older than me in school, ended up in prison. Really, it was when the Ulster Defence Regiment started to came on scene, and we'd be coming from dances. I was only about 15, 16 at the time. And these are people that I previously knew, and I always recall the first time I was stopped by them, and by a guy who knew well and played football with, several years older than me, in Randalston, and he was asking me my name and where I was coming from, where I was going to, and he was embarrassed doing that. But the second or third time, there was no embarrassment, there was just hostility. And I think it was then I realised that there are two communities, but it's nothing to do with what church you go to on a Sunday. It's that one is armed, has weapons and uniforms, and can basically do whatever they want. And I think that was probably the main thing that swung my decision that I wanted to become involved. I wanted to do something. And when I was 16,
what did you do?
Pardon?
What did you do?
Well, because I came from an area I didn't know really any Republicans. I'm still not sure how it happened, but I have a good idea that one night when I was at a dance, actually in Arboe in County Tyrone, I mentioned to a guy from Tunbridge who I went to school with, and said what I was thinking and what I was going to do. And he was saying to me, well, you've got to be careful and doing that there and such like. And then a few months later, I was approached by someone. I suppose looking back on it, it was a situation that was orchestrated. I was given a lift down to a dance hall, money glass dance hall, and just outside Tunbridge. And the driver of the car is just me and him, and he says, I believe you're looking to join the IRA. And I said, yes. And It took several months. My first meeting was with a man and a woman, again, much older than me. And it probably surprised me at the time that it was a woman, who was obviously senior in the IRA at the time, and trying to dissuade me from doing it, would end up in prison or end up dead. I said I still wanted to do it. So the whole process probably took about 8 or 9 months, but by the time I was 17, at the end of 1973, I became active as a volunteer.
And how long were you active then before you were imprisoned? 3 or 4 years?
Well, I was arrested on 2nd of August 1976. So I suppose 2.5 years. You know.
Okay. And what had you done in that 2.5 years?
Well, I ended up in 74 on the run. I had been spotted on an operation where I had to be driving a car that was hijacked, but with not having a mask on. And the word started to go about this, particularly not my own area. That someone who had spotted me knew me, and so I ended up in the run at that time. Ended up in the south. Then in 1975, there was a lengthy ceasefire begun. I'd been back and forward up the north in between that. And then really from 75, I was in the north full time. And I suppose shouldn't have been at my house the night I was, and was raided the next morning, and I was charged with an attack on an RUC Land Rover patrol, where one was injured, and with causing explosions. And ended up, I was sentenced in April 1977. When I went into jail, I mean, obviously that was a very particular year, 1976. I was 19 at that time. It was the year that political status was removed from the 1st of March. Sort of things you only become aware of when you end up in prison, because it was a lovely summer, very warm summer, and but suddenly, I mean, people were coming into jail by the dozens that year. As I say, you become aware of it later. This was part of a very comprehensive counterinsurgency program that the British had now developed. Criminalisation was just one part of it. There was changes to the courts. Juries were done away with. Diplomat courts, as they were called, were introduced. It was just one judge. Powers of arrest and detention were changed. You could be held for up to 7 days in interrogation centres without access to lawyers, etc. But as a 19-year-old coming into jail, you're wrong about that.
Is that what happened to you, Laurence?
Yes, I was taken to Castlereagh. This was a total, I'd never been arrested and interrogated before. This was a totally new situation. Castlereagh was one of the special interrogation centres, probably the main one, along with Golf Barracks in Armagh and Strand Road in Derry. And as I say, it was for part of a whole new programme. There had been that lengthy ceasefire. I suppose the British had built up a lot of intelligence during that time. There had been incident centres where the local IRA liaised actually with British Army patrols in the areas. So I suppose when they were ready to move, then they had all that information, and we ended up calling it a conveyor belt process from arrest through Castlereagh, through the diplomat courts, and then into the H blocks or Armagh Women's Prison.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I went through that process, as I say, at the time, unaware of what was really taking place at the time.
You were a little cog in history, really.
Oh yeah, well, minor cog in it. I'm very naive, I suppose.
At that time, but not always a minor cog, but we'll come to that. So what was you ended up in the H blocks. What were they like, and how did they differ from other prisons?
Well, the H blocks, first, they get the name from the style of them. They're built as if you're looking from above, aerial photo. They are a H, and each part of the uprights are wings. So there's 4 wings, A, B, C, D, and the centerpiece was the administrative part where the governor, doctor's office and all were. Apparently they were based on a German design for a prison that was constructed for the Baader-Meinhof gang. I don't know if that's true or not, but the whole idea of them was meant to give maximum control to the prison guards. Prior to March the 1st, anybody who was arrested for Involvement with the conflict was given political status. They were in Long Case, which was another part of the same prison complex. Bobby's hands had been held there before, had political status, so they wore their own clothes, didn't do prison work, had their own command structures, studied, learned Irish, did handicrafts, etc. And I suppose that gave very much an image of a prisoner of war camp. And the British were determined at that time to change that image and to say we're just criminals. And what's very interesting is the language that was created at that time. And I've always speculated on how downtown radio was set up in 1976. And it was actually the first British radio station, public service, to get the license, even before any other ones in England or Scotland or Wales. And they used to do like a news bulletin every 20 minutes. And what you suddenly started to hear was this talk of godfathers and mafia-style shootouts, sectarian gangs, language that had never been used. I mean, if you went on to the BBC, actually, one time, in an interview with a woman from BBC Radio 4, asked her to go back and check, the language they used in 1975. And I said, you won't find anything about mafia-style shootouts or godfathers or anything like that. You'll actually hear people have been described as IRA volunteers and active service units. And she did, and she came back, she said, yes, she was amazed. So suddenly there was a whole new language associated with this. The blocks, again, as I say, we had heard rumours when we were on remand that they were sinking. So this sort of confirmed to us that, this is just some crazy policy that the British have thought up and it will last 6 months and will disappear. I was there when, just before Kieran Nugent was the first person sentenced, the first Republican sentenced under this new legislation. And I remember the day vividly. We're in the prison yard, C Wing, remand. And Barney McReynolds, who was the OC, called a meeting, literally with just everybody but round, stop playing football. And he said, look, Kieran's going to get sentenced next week. The policy is we don't wear the prison uniform or do prison work. Everybody was right, and go back to playing football and whatever. And Kieran was sentenced to 3 years for membership. And even though Kieran was only about, I think, 18 at the time, he already had been interned and had been on remand. And so probably, out of all the people to be sentenced first, he was probably the best person because he was a very tough guy. He got sentenced, taken down to the H blocks, was stripped, told to wear the uniform, refused to do it, famously said, you'll have to nail it to my back. And was thrown in the cell naked for several days and then given blankets. And that began what became known as the blanket protest. It lasted for 5 years. Kieran was actually released during it. So all of which we were totally unaware of in the warm sunshine of 1976.
And then there was also the no wash or dirty protest.
Yeah, which is an interesting one again about the language, because dirty protest was the term given to it by the Northern Ireland office, whereas we call it the no wash protest. And our irony about it is our numbers started to build up from Kieran was sentenced. I was sentenced in April 1977, by which time there's around about 100 people on the protest. During that year, another block was opened, H3, and at the start of 78, H4 was opened. So the numbers were really rising. Probably at that time there was probably about 300 close on it. And I think there was probably a determined attempt then by the authorities to stop this. They didn't think the protest was going to last that long. What we noticed was there's a lot more beatings of people when they're arriving at the H blocks. I think
by the prison officers.
By the prison officers, yeah. I think the thought was that if you could break people before they got down the wings, then that was the way to do it. Whereas once they got down on the wings and we were together as a group, then it was going to be more difficult. There wasn't so much brutality in the wings at that time because we weren't doing anything, we weren't good. We were refusing to take visits, etc., because you had to wear the prison uniform. And there had been a sort of coexistence from that sort of September 76 up until early March. But then also discovered that
coexistence between who?
Ourselves, the protest prisoners and the prison guards. I mean, there were some incidents, but compared to what there was in the other years, they were minor. I mean, we brushed out our cells, even up, we had 2 showers a week, we could get access to the toilets. So prison guards are coming in and opening, and it's sort of It's not a hostile environment in the way it became later. Then we discovered that we weren't getting access to the showers or to the toilets. People were having to go to the toilet in their own cell, and we decided at the start of March 1978, well, it's a very mild protest against it, to refuse to brush out our cells in the morning. You used to come around with a brush and walk, and you could brush out the cell, and still about, you could talk on the door to other people who were next door to you. And the reaction was major by the authorities. They ended up taking 2 people, Tommy Féile and Sean Campbell, to the punishment block and charged them under some really obscure law about sedition. And we continued on with that protest the next week. The next step of it was we would refuse to wash in the cells, just to bring around basins of water. We washed in the cell a bit. We said, no, we want to actually go up to the sinks, up to the showers. And again, the reaction was practically no one's getting out to the showers, wash, toilets, or anything. We ended up having to use the cells. And within a period of 3 days, we went from what had been the norm into one where we were on a no wash protest that we had never planned. The irony was we were protesting to get better access to toilet and wash facilities. We ended up on what became known as a no wash protest, where we smeared the walls with excreta, poured urine out the bottom of the doors, and really from then on, that's when the real brutality started. And during the time, actually, when the wing I was in at the time, in H5, prison guards come in to take out the furniture, beds, and everything else, and we started to smash them up and try to throw them out the windows. And they just got wired into people with heavy beatings. 2 people from my wing, Kevin Campbell from Derry and Drew Forbes from Strabane, were just, I think Drew was actually knocked out, dragged unconscious down the wing. And it was so within a period of 2 weeks, it went from a sort of, as I say, coexistence in the place into now like a total
an escalation.
conflict. Yes, but the thing about it was that it was the first time really that it hit the news on the outside. Prior to that, there'd always been reports about the number of people sentenced, but never really mentioned about those on protest. They always mentioned the people who were conforming. Suddenly now there was talk in the media about the situation, emergency situation. It's talked about should they be given sort of emergency political status. There's a fear that there's going to be all sorts of disease run through the blocks because we weren't washing, because we're no sort of confined to a cell. So in a sense, I think that's one for most people. I know for myself, it was like a boost to morale, because you're now doing something. Like prior to that, for the previous 18 months, we'd just been sitting there, nothing to do, couldn't get out of our cells apart from, say, go to the toilet to get a shower. There's no real word about it apart from our families, relatives had started to organise groups, relative action committees, all women, largely all women, people like Mary Níos in Derry and Belfast, other ones from Torfloyd's I was in the buildings with, Mrs. Holden, Ms. McCardle, with May, all women who started to highlight the situation because it was their sons or husbands or whatever who were on the protests. So whilst the conditions...
Those images, Laurence, those images got a lot of traction in the media. Some people saw them as almost Christ-like and iconic with the blanket and the long hair. Others saw them as something bestial. It divided people. Were you conscious of this?
Probably not at the time. I mean, this was something in later years. And it's other people's interpretation. I mean, we weren't setting out to create any image. We were refusing to wash, refusing to have our hair cut, or refusing to shave. There was a period where the prison guards come in very brutally, force washed people,
with hoses,
held them down and shaved their beards off, cut off men. Probably just, in my view, an excuse to wage a period of intense brutality. thankfully, the block I was in, H5, it didn't happen in it. I've never known why it didn't. Was it because there's such an outcry in the media about it? Because priests coming in for mass on Sunday, seen the bruises, seen the cuts and the black eyes, families seen it on visits, so it ended up being stopped. But the other thing about the image, I know it's been even done by famous artists have looked at it. The whole thing, the Citizen, which is based on a photograph of Hugh Rooney, which the artist whose name I now can't remember did it, but it appeared in the Tate Gallery for at least 3 years. I went over to see the exhibition of it. So yeah, there's people give it this like a religious iconography, but like, it wasn't something we set out to achieve. And yes, and for other people, and particularly for the prison guards, they would just say these are just animals, you know, living in your own shit, and so whatever you get is to serve it. And yeah, it was for them probably an system then really to dehumanize people. They see us as something other than them, you know, human.
Yeah. So let me move you on to the hunger strikes then. I mean, I suppose what you're describing is a kind of intensification of protest, which culminated in perhaps the ultimate protest, self-starvation. There had been a strike in 1980, which was aborted. It started again in 1981. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, hunger strike had always been talked about throughout the protest, simply because political status, when it was first introduced in 1972, was following a hunger strike by Bliain and others in Crumlin Road Prison. And down through history, Portlaoise Prison, others, going back to 1917 and Francoch and all, I mean, you have various hunger strikes.
Well, and the suffragettes used.
Yep, it certainly is. Yes, it's definitely a form of protest that people could use, but it was held back from them probably because people had enough cop on at the time to know that, you know, this isn't 1972, and this whole criminalisation is very much part of it's very much integral to this overall policy of the Brits. But we couldn't continue in those circumstances just indefinitely. There had been all sorts of attempts by people like Cardinal O'C and others behind the scenes to get some resolution to it. He had thought that one time we were getting our own clothes, and then we were getting prison issue clothes, civilian type, they called them. Excuse me, but that's still prison issue. So all of it had been tried, all the RACs, the National Anti-Hitchcocks Armagh Committee, protests abroad, everything. We were still sitting with nothing. There was the hunger strike in 1980, ended when we thought that it was going to be resolved, and then discovered that it wasn't. And I think even then, Bobby Sands, who had taken over as the camp OC, tried his best to see if there was any sort of chance of compromise anywhere at all on any issue. But at the same time, I think knowing that there wasn't going to be, and there wasn't absolutely nothing. The governor of the jail, Hilditch, at the time told him to tell everybody was conforming, there'd be nothing, and then once you conform, you could get what conforming prisoners got. There was a really, again, strange and emotional time, anger at what had happened after the first hunger strike. For some people, despair. Some people had come back on the protest for the first hunger strike and then left again. But generally the mood was one of anger and yes, a lot of energy going towards another hunger strike. And we now know what happened with it. It was very differently constructed. Bobby would go first and allow a gap of 2 weeks for Francis Hughes to join it, in the hope that there was a place at time Bobby would definitely die, but that possibly then by then there would be an opportunity to resolve the situation after that. When he started it, it was very bleak, and then suddenly he got elected as an MP. We went from real sort of certainty Bobby's going to die to a point of, oh God, we've won. I mean, he's been elected as an MP. How can you turn around and say people are criminals? And then very, very quickly after that, realizing that no, the Brits are going to let them die, because the only thing they did was to introduce new legislation, which meant that in future a prisoner couldn't stand in elections. And then the thought was, well, if they let an MP die, we'll certainly let the others die, which is what they did. But it was, I mean, when people ask that question about, should you just go on a hunger strike or whatever, I was always said, like, it wasn't like you had this range of choices. We do A or B or C. It was either total capitulation to the system, and that just wasn't going to happen, or a hunger strike. And then in that situation, a hunger strike doesn't seem bad. And the other thing about it is that, we knew about it. Well, our belief was that they criminalised us, they criminalised the whole Republican struggle. And not just even in that contemporary situation, but you could then say, well, then the whole thing from ever a day was criminal. So we weren't going to allow that to happen. We knew we weren't criminals, but families, with communities who supported us. But the other thing was about just how we were going to live the rest of our time in jail. I mean, I was doing life. The majority of prisoners were doing life because life sentences were given out for everything. Possession of explosives, attempted murder, whatever. So it's a very real political reality and practical reality. Am I for the next 15, 20 years going to be going yes or no, sort of 3 packs full serve? And the other thing was there was such a bond created over that period of time with the blanket men, and somewhere I would have been with the women in Armagh jail. An amazing bond. I mean, you couldn't let a hunger strike where 10 people died where they had just arrived into prison. Just wouldn't happen. It took that 5 years of intense conditions, brutality, all the rest of it, to build up that sort of mindset, but also that bond between one another that sustained people through the hunger strike, sustained them as they died through it.
So there was a group of prisoners lined up and ready to join the hunger strike to replace the men as they died one by one. 4 men, I think, were dead by the time you joined. Is that right?
That's right, yes. There only originally was 4 on it. And then in June, like McFarlane, who was the OC at that time, it was decided to increase the numbers on the hunger strike to 8. So on each consecutive Monday, someone joined it. So I was the last of that 4 to join it on the 29th of June.
Mm-hmm. And was it daunting, the idea that you were stepping into a dead man's shoes?
Well, there was a sense of what was happening, as in the enormity of it now. In some sense, what we were nigh the storm, and there's all these other things happening outside and going on. Whereas for us, it's still it's nearly the battle between us and the screws, the prison guards. There's awareness that that this is the final battle. I mean, that's whatever happens. This is the end of the blanket protest. This is the end of. We already ended the no watch protest at the start of the hunger strike. So whatever is the outcome, and obviously we were hoping for the best outcome. This is the final battle of it, and there's more of that sense of it. Yeah, that it was you were a bit active. It was a battle. You didn't see it lightly. You didn't do it in any sort of fatalistic way. You also didn't do it with any sort of big ego way. It was just you just knew that this has to happen, and I'd volunteered for it. Everybody had been over 100 volunteered for it, I believe.
100 volunteered for it.
Pardon?
Did you say 100 volunteered?
Yeah, as my knowledge, there was 100 people that volunteered.
And how were the volunteers chosen? Was it the strongest, the ones who were most likely to survive it or to last for the longest period of days?
I know, because the thing with it is that as hunger strike shows, you couldn't look at someone physically and say, well, yeah, they could last this length of time. And then Martin Herson died very early on, after 46 days. Brendan McLaughlin had joined it and discovered that he had a bleeding ulcer, had to be taken off it. Everybody was malnourished before they went on it. I mean, I was 10.5 stone before I went on it. Probably I was about 2 stone underweight. And it would have been the same with Bobby and Frank and everybody else. So no, there wasn't that idea. What would have been based on in terms of selection was obviously, well, two major things would be how long you'd been in prison and how long was your sentence. Like, so if someone was due out in a few years, it's unlikely they were going to be chosen for it. Though again, if Bobby hadn't have been on the hunger strike or died on the hunger strike, he would have been out within 3 or 4 years. So it's more about, you know, how long you've been on the protest, how well that people know you, think that, and how do you ever say that someone can go right through it? You know, it's impossible to say that, other than based on, you know, things like you've known them, they're going to be here for a long time yet, and they've already been here for quite some time, and that they're, you know, sensible and logical enough. And the thing is, it's just not a matter of putting forward your name and getting picked. Again, you're told, or I was told to carefully rethink the putting forward my name. And then when I was told that I would be starting it, I got a small com from the Army Council, which I'm not living here, but it was along the lines of, comrade, you've volunteered to join the hunger strike. Do you realise this means that within 2 months you will most likely be dead? Reconsider your decision. Army Council. So it's a very blunt statement, very short statement, one cigarette paper. And if you hadn't have thought about it before, it certainly would have made you think about it. But I know I had, and I'm sure everybody else had thought about it very deeply before they ever put their name forward, because they knew that now the struggle in that sense is resting on you. So it's, you know, you have to be pretty clear in your head. But I was 24 years of age, I was single, there's people on it who were married, like Joe McDonald, with children, like Bobby, Joe, Maggie Devine, you know, so, and I totally believed in the protest and in our politics, you know.
What was the mood like in the prison as the men started dying, beginning with Bobby Sands, but, you know, one by one, really?
Yeah. Well, very somber. As I remember, Bobby died. At that time when he died, we didn't hear until later the next morning, whereas other wings knew. We didn't have most of us had smuggled radios, and we had lost one in our wing. So it was later that morning. It was actually Father Toner came in, and Brendan Hughes, who'd been on the first hunger strike, was in our wing, and Father Toner came in and told him and left, and as we heard him going out, Brendan got up to the door and said, "Bobby's dead." So I've been expecting it, but still, when we're told, you know, it's now like you've moved into a new phase, like someone's now actually dead. And as I say, the fact that we knew that it's just not Bobby Sands volunteer, IRA volunteers doing it, Bobby Sands MP as well. So this looks bleak for Frank and it. And originally,
sorry, I suppose you realised that Margaret Thatcher, who was the British Prime Minister at that time, wasn't one of life's compromisers, and there was a reality you might not achieve your goals.
I suppose for us it didn't matter who was. Yes, in history, she is that figure, and she loved the title of Iron Lady and all the rest. I suppose for us at the time, we didn't care who was, you know, Prime Minister or what they were saying. And I mean, you could say, well, maybe that was naivety on our part, but I don't think it did really matter who was there. I mean, one of the very interesting things was that short after my release from jail, I did an interview for BBC Panorama programme, and they're going to do it in detail. The conclusion of their programme was that she was going to give the reforms. Around that time, where the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace came in, we now know there was all this behind the scenes contact with the IRA. At the same time, the ICJP came into the jail dust on hunger strike. Their conclusion was that she was going to give it, and the only reason that they didn't follow through with it was because the 6 top NIO civil servants, including the prison governor, threatened to resign if there were any reforms. And I have to say, as soon as the guy said that, it made total sense to me, because all the NIO civil servants were very unionist. Whereas Thatcher then a day is, for all her talk about inequality and all the rest of it, all politicians ultimately are pragmatic. It's interesting, during that time, the chief constable, who had been Jack Herman, and the British Army's GOC both wrote to Thatcher personally, talking about the situation, in the sense that they have been, going all out to get us into jail. And now they're seeing a situation unfolding where they know what support for the IRA is. It's just increasing, 100-fold every day. So they're looking at it from a security aspect and saying, I don't know what they asked her to do. So it's interesting, looking back on the history. That was their conclusion, that whenever they threatened to resign, then she felt she couldn't do nothing other than to hold the line. I know she still is a figure of hate for Republicans, and in terms of what she did with mining communities and in Ireland, yes, she earned that reputation.
She also signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement.
Well, as I say, it takes, it's like Ian Paisley ended up in government with Martin McGuinness, and sometimes it's strange, but I always thought that was interesting. And I remember on a program one time with RTE, someone speaking and saying that Thatcher's private secretary had also said something similar, but again, that wouldn't ever come out until decades later, I suppose. So who knows? But at the end of the day,
let me bring you back to day one of your own hunger strike, Laurence. Can you take us through what happened? Was food still delivered to your cell? Was it taken away when you didn't eat it, or was it left there?
Well, the first day I was moved from the wing I was into a wing where there were a couple of other hunger strikers, Paddy Quinn, Tom McAwee, the wing that Beck McFarlane, who was the OC, was in H3. Taken out to the doctor, weighed, blood pressure taken, told by the doctor that the damage would be done to my body, but also that they wouldn't be intervening with medical attention unless I requested it. So very procedural, it's a sort of a strange situation. I'm conscious that you're now in the media outside that you're mentioned, but in some sense, life hasn't changed for me other than I haven't had my breakfast. Yes, the food is put in the cell and continued right up until it was on 68 days before they stopped putting food in it. So the breakfast would be set in, sit on the table until lunch. Lunch would be set in, it would be taken out, I would sit there. And the thing about that is, it never annoyed me about food sitting there, but going through the hunger strike, your eyesight starts to go, but as your eyesight goes, your sense of smell really intensifies. So this food sitting congealing on the table does start to really, really annoy you, as in the smell of it. But yes, that's done every day. I suppose
annoy you because it's appetizing, or annoy you because it starts to repulse you?
Repulse, it's the smell of it. I mean, the smell, like floor polish, things that you'd never notice in any other time suddenly become really overpowering, to the point where you're like almost nauseous. I remember one time a prison guard brought me in a jug of water, and I poured a glass and went to drink it, and it reeked of Old Spice aftershave lotion. And to me, it was as if the glass was full of Old Spice aftershave lotion. And I said to him, I knew he wasn't. There was a guy, Paul Lennon, he was pretty sound. He was a trained nurse as well as a prison guard. And it turned out he had put on aftershave a couple of days earlier, previously, but he'd showered over time since then and washed his hands and all the rest of it. He couldn't smell it at all. So your smell, the senses are just become amazingly overpowering, or acute. So therefore, other smells. So the food in that sense never bothered me. I suppose at the start, the thing that really helped me was the coldness. You're encouraged to drink at least 6 pints of water a day. I probably drank a lot more than that at the start, though it comes in increasingly difficult later on. And again, you start to smell water, which wouldn't normally do. Which makes it difficult to drink. But I suppose we're not having food and drinking a lot of cold water. It was during the summer when the heat went off in the blocks, and the blocks were done very swampy, sort of like the water would come up through the floor. So one time I remember having blankets folded over, got extra blankets. I think one time I had something like 12 layers of blankets on me just to stay warm. Thankfully, I didn't have maybe a bit of a mild headache the first couple of days, but nothing much. There were some other people that said that a more maybe a greater reaction going on to it. And just that emptiness feeling. I suppose we're drinking water to fill your stomach a bit, but I've always said to people, it's not like, people say like, we're not hungry. It's not like if you, like I've seen me say, working at the computer for through the day, and before you realise maybe it's 2 or 3 o'clock and you haven't had lunch or anything, suddenly you feel hungry, but it's only because you've come aware that you've sort of missed out on lunch that you get this sense of it. But whenever you have decided that you're not going to eat, and there's not that, it's hard to describe that sense of hunger. There might be like a bit of an emptiness, but not, and I think even that disappears as time goes on, because anyway, part of your stomach does shrink.
So you never fantasized about food during this period?
Well, during the time we would, I say us in the prison hospital watching TV. It's always interesting when you got to the prison hospital on hunger strike, you were no longer a protesting prisoner, so you were able to get cigarettes and access to TV, you know, because the fact that you're in the hospital, you were now wearing pajamas, so you weren't refusing to wear the prison uniform. And the fact you were in the hospital meant that you were unable to do prison work, so you weren't refusing to do prison work. So the irony was that, you know, by being on the hunger strike and in the hospital, you were no longer a non-conforming prisoner. But we would watch, you know, ads, and there'd be ones come up for food, and we'd be talking about, you know, the sort of meals we were going to get once the hunger strike was over, and like hamburgers or chicken curries, which I'd never had a chicken curry before in the jail. So this was a totally new thing that you hear people from the cages talking about some of the meals they made. So in all there was that. It wasn't that you were off the idea of food. It was just, you know, how it was going to be great whenever this was all over, you got status and all the rest of it. But not since it didn't annoy you or impact in that sort of sense, to say all of the smell and stuff as it sort of got cold was more problematic.
And Laurence, were you aware of huge national and international interest in the hunger strikes? I mean, there were black flags all over Ireland. The international media was covering it. Or were you in a little bubble of determination?
No, well, probably by the time we get into the prison hospital, we're a bit more isolated from some of that news. We're actually allowed newspapers not there, but like when I was in the blocks, we had a very, very good communication system with outside. Not only were we having comms smuggled in by families, we had the Phobail Republican News was photocopied and miniaturized and sent into us. There were people who wrote out in detail on cigarette papers any protest, any media coverage that we're getting. So probably us in the blocks during the protest, we're getting far more information than anybody on the outside in any individual area, because we were getting it from all, you know, people out that visit from Derry, and they were getting reporting back about what happened there, or from Uri or from Belfast. Whereas when you're actually on the hunger strike and in the prison hospital, then you're cut off a bit from that. But because you had already been aware of the extent of it, you knew that was continuing. And you had radio and papers, although they weren't going to cover a lot of the stuff that we otherwise would have been getting in, like from local activists, etc. So yes, we had. I suppose it's only in later years you realise the extent of it, particularly in other countries, and things that happens. For instance, whenever Bobby died, that the Indian Parliament had a minute's silence, and the Portuguese Parliament had the same. They had, you know, dockers in America refusing to unload British ships, etc. And protests like that, probably all the major cities, Paris and Montreal and Melbourne and all the rest of it. And so, so at the time, it's very much aware of what was going on. I suppose it was only in later years that I realised the extent of it, and particularly the extent of local protests. And I remember after my release speaking at an event organised by Falls Community Council, and we're doing a talk about the timelines from people who were for various activists. A Mark from Relatives for Justice was speaking about it. He was having a big out.
Mark Thompson.
Mark Thompson.
Chief Executive.
And he was saying like he could recall going out with his parents, and his mother always getting to put on his, he was only, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 at the time, to put on his helmet for hurling. I actually laughed at him. I think turned and said, like, what would you be putting that on for? He says, plastic bullets. And then it just hit me, of course. Like the number of plastic bullets were fired during that period. I mean, I think that it's kind of the one fired every second. Through that period, you see them times of on Sean Down's been killed. Like they're just firing and they're loading again. They're firing, they're loading, they're firing. And I remember thinking at the time, I'd $2 and one young daughters. Would I have thought of taking them out on a protest? You know, but that shows you the extent to which the whole community was behind the protest.
And was this the first time politics had been used as a mechanism to resolve issues? I mean, did this strengthen the Armalite and the ballot box philosophy?
I think it did. I mean, I think for me that both in the jail and outside the jail, the hunger strike changed things dramatically. I mean, I think after it, even those people who wouldn't have been, I mean, obviously everybody who voted for Bobby Sands wasn't the support of the IRA. It just isn't that amount of support. But people had come to a point where they just weren't going to go along with what was the status quo. So even if they didn't fully agree with what the IRA were doing, they weren't going to do anything till stop it. It was, I think because it lasted so long, 217 days, that period of just, I mean, normal life, people maybe weren't at work the same, or they've gone out in protests. Normal life, social relations, everything sort of changed around that period. People took on a new thought, I think, about things, all of which then sort of evolved afterwards, and particularly the role of women into the fore, who generally were the ones organising the protests, and then became very much the fore afterwards as political representatives. And yes, it did certainly. I mean, as I said earlier about the chief constable and the GOC writing Thatcher, we now know that, I mean, the IRA got tons upon tons upon tons of armaments after that, thousands upon hundreds of thousands probably of dollars or euros or whatever, like just the support worldwide. And it's probably maybe the first time Republicans became aware of just the extent of that support and how people were looking on Ireland. And what was happening there and the resistance. And even to this day, whether it's in Palestine or wherever else, that people look to Ireland and the struggle, and particularly the prison struggle. But yeah, it obviously really helped that. I suppose it shifted the mindset of Republicans in terms of electoral politics. I mean, in the prison we were saying during the hunger strike, why isn't Sinn Féin standing for local councils? I mean, there was People's Democracy was standing, the IRSP was standing, Irish Independent Party, all of who were supportive of our demands. And the only ones missing was Sinn Féin, because they had the abstentionist policy. And our view in the jail was, I mean, get rid of it. But it was another 5 years before that changed. But it did, obviously, it obviously showed to Republicans the idea of straight involvement, protest, and uniting with other groups. I mean, the anti-Hitchcocks Armagh Committee was made up of people from very diverse politics, but could come together for a common cause.
Did it show people perhaps that politics was more effective than violence?
I think it was probably the early years before that really happened. And I think Republicans would have been very happy with continuing just the ballot box and the Armalite if you're going to get voted for, and at the same time carry out an arms struggle. But I think as years went on, firstly there's some contradictions thrown up out there. If you're out canvassing for votes, at the same time maybe a bomb goes off in the street, and maybe it's accidental, someone gets killed or injured or whatever. So the practicalities almost of waging an armed struggle while still trying to have be involved in electoral politics. I think some of the contradictions were highlighted there, but I think also really, I suppose for me, the armed struggle ended because there was a realization amongst Republicans that we could continue for another 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, even in captured British documents, they also state that the IRA had the capacity. But just like the blanket protest and hunger strike, it's not about continuing, it's about getting to your objective. And if the tactic's not working, then you've got to look at another tactic. And I think by then, and the time I got out of jail, Sinn Féin was dominant in a lot of councils. Like before I went in, Sinn Féin didn't even take part in elections. And then from that time, from 92 onwards, just continued to grow and grow. So I think it came a point where people saying that politics works in the sense of people want you to be standing and are prepared to elect you, and then you can go to wherever it is, councils or assemblies, and start to make decisions that matter, sitting alongside the idea that there's certain contradictions now with the armed struggle. Plus, the overall thing is, can we militarily defeat the British? And I think the realization was we couldn't, the same as the British couldn't militarily defeat the IRA, so it was a stalemate. And I think when you're in a revolutionary situation, you can't have a stalemate because the status quo is winning out there. And it was always interesting that whenever the IRA did call the secession in 1994, James Molyneux, who was then the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, said this is the biggest disaster to hit unionism since the foundation of the state. So the fact that someone in the union has seen an IRA ceasefire is the biggest sort of catastrophe probably says a lot, that they always need it. I would say even today, they need an enemy, something to rally behind, And whenever the IRA went off the scene, then now the focus was on all of the other things. And one of the things that's intriguing, and given it in July, I mean, throughout the conflict, Orange Order parades continued as they always had done through all these nationalist areas. And it wasn't until mid-90s that suddenly there was almost a realization, now with the absence of an armed struggle, of, hold on a minute, what about all these other issues of equality? And here's these people troopsing through our areas. Just watching the footage yesterday from the Ormo Road back, I think it was 1996, and people have just been battened off the streets to allow this orange march to take place. So it was like a new awareness coming about once the armed struggle ended.
Well, it was rights-based, wasn't it? People knew their rights and asked for them fairly determinedly. We've left a kind of a key part of your story out, which is you got to day 70 on hunger strike, and there was a turning point. Take us through that.
Well, I mean, as we now know, during the hunger strike, people were dying one by one. Our families weren't volunteers. It was the most tragic situation for them, that they were totally supportive of our demands, but as I say, they weren't volunteers, and they come under increasing pressure, particularly from the church, and particularly Father Féile, who had been a strong supporter of our demands up until then. I think that's actually another sort of thing that the hunger strike threw up. It challenged the Catholic Church. I know of a lot of people who just broke with the Catholic Church at that time because of their attitude towards the coffins of dead hunger strikers not being allowed into the chapel with the tricolour on it. Whereas people could look and see in England or elsewhere, British soldiers who were Catholics being buried with flags on them. So it changed their attitude, and I think Father Féile was very conservative, ultra-conservative in terms of theology, and I think seeing people on the streets taking their own power is something now that the church was losing its power. So from being supported, became very, very proactive, as in organising meetings and literally going around families, etc., etc. And I think that also brought into a time where families were starting to lose hope that we were going to get in, and people talked about, we were just dying to show we could die.
You weren't allowed to die. Your family didn't allow you to die. Did you go into a coma?
Yeah, what happened with me was that my families were allowed in at the latter stages of a hunger strike. If you were still alive, some people died very suddenly and didn't get a chance to come like a week, and others. But I progressed that way. I got to a point where I couldn't get out of bed. what we had noticed development over a period of time was that just a few days before someone died, they'd have a bowel movement. And it's almost like the reverse. We hear about people getting home and then their bowels open afterwards. This is almost like, you know, the body's breaking down and having that first. It's a very, very painful and very lengthy experience. But what you notice afterwards that people just deteriorated rapidly in really 2 or 3 days. And that happened to me on the 68th day. And that was me. We'd always try to even just get out of bed and sit on a chair beside us. But I couldn't even do that. My family were allowed in. It was lucid at that time. All of them, apart from my mother, asked me to come off it. And it wasn't that my mother was a staunch Republican. She wasn't. She was radicalized during the whole protest. But just her and I had, for whatever reason, had a very, very close connection. Even though I had said I'd been away on the run and then I was in jail. But always had that bond. On the 69th day, apparently I was still responding, but I was getting people confused. Maybe somebody was speaking to an uncle visiting me and an aunt, and I was confusing people. And then I don't remember that. That was the 69th day. The 70th day, which was a Sunday, it was a morning. What happens is whenever it's deemed that you're unconscious, power of attorney shifts to your next of kin. So whilst the prison weren't going to intervene and give medical intervention, which is basically glucose, your family can sign and authorize that on your behalf because you're unconscious. So apparently on the Sunday, what they did is ground and test all your reflexes and pronounce you that you're in a deep coma by that stage and not going to ever speak again, as in yourself coming back around again. And my mother authorized medical intervention, which I say is basically, we knew at the time, not only from the doctors and other people on strike, they had these very large syringes, like huge syringes of glucose that they always had on standby in case there was any sort of, the whole situation was resolved or whatever. So anyway, I came around and regained consciousness. I was in the intensive care unit of the Royal Victoria Hospital. I was blind at the time. And it was a nurse who told me where I was. I realised by then, say what had happened. I'd said to my mother before, well, she knew my position when I wasn't coming off the hunger strike. I said that she'd never asked me. What she did say, and probably didn't make sense at the time, but afterwards it makes sense to me now. She said, "You know what you have to do, and I know what I have to do." And she's very quiet, one mother. And I think what I meant was, what you have to do is follow through what you said you were going to do. And I think if I had died suddenly, she would have seen it as God's will, probably that was it. But if it ended up in the situation that it ended up in, she would do what she had felt she had to do, which was, she's now been posed, right, he's unconscious, he's not coming around again, do you want to authorize this? I don't know, she struggled with that whole idea of it, but she did it. And people often ask them, do you ever hold out against it? And I said, absolutely not. I mean, families were caught in the most tragic situation. She herself died less than 2 years later, and the hunger strike really impacted her health. As it did with other families of everybody else who was on it. So I was in the Royal Victoria for probably 24 hours and then moved to the secure unit in Musgrave Park Hospital, where there really was others who had been on the hunger strike, and had been taken over. Pat McKeown, who later became a councillor in Belfast, and a couple of others, Paddy Quinn did.
And how did you feel when life was restored to you?
I've often said, Martina, it's a very strange place. You've instead of people, if you think of when you're tired and then multiply it about 100 times, so it's not just physical, it's mental, it's emotional, because everybody who was on hunger strike wanted to live, so they battled to stay alive the whole time until the point that they died. There's no death wish or suicide wish or martyrdom wish or anything out there. I mean, they all wanted to, and it is about using all your energy and what becomes psychological energy, emotional energy to follow through that. So then to find still alive, it's like you've gone through it and dead now, but now you're not dead. It was just like a very empty space. I was neither happy to be alive.
You felt empty.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I could say I felt nothing. I mean, I could just a vacuum. I knew I was alive. I wasn't happy to be alive. I wasn't sad to be alive. I didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow, the next day, whatever. I existed. That was really all.
And
I
did
felt
you
for that
experience
much.
any long-term health effects from it?
Yeah, I know my eyesight was damaged. Actually, it's not so much the eyesight, it's the brain cell controlling the optic nerve. Started to break down and I ended up with what's called nystagmus, which is a twitching of the eyeball. Now, I've sort of battled with it over the years and got it fairly settled down, whereas at the start, I mean, from a distance, you can see that my eyes were going here, but then it throws you off balance and trying to read or everything. And because it's the brain cell which doesn't renew, then you're left with just controlling it. But I mean, I read, right?
Do you have any issues around food?
No, it's funny people ask that. I did have an issue. I got treated for, but 9 months after, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is a bowel problem. And I was treated for the next 11 years in prison and couldn't have been on, around 10 and 16 tablets a day. I'd go to Musgrave Park Hospital twice a year for examination. And one time a doctor in the jail who was very friendly, and he only lasted a short time, and he said to me, "Laurence, there's a theory about dairy products and ulcerative colitis." And I think maybe for a short time, maybe I did try to stop, but we didn't control our own diet. I always loved cereal in the morning, so it's milk. We had no other options then of non-dairy products, so I probably didn't sustain for a while. But it always stuck in my mind. And when I got out of jail, and I had soya milk and all the rest, I tried it, and I knew within a week that the symptoms had gone. And so obviously during the hunger strike, whatever impact it had on the intestines, it made me lactose intolerant because I cut out all dairy, and then I started slowly introduce pieces, but I've never taken ordinary milk. But I think that was. But other than that,
you've had a very productive and creative life since you left prison. You did a PhD. You're a writer. You made a film about your experience, H3. Has this involvement helped you make sense of your experience, transmuting it into art?
I think so. I mean, there was a process that started in the prison after the hunger strike. Through a series of other protests, we ended up with all the demands that we'd set out to have. We ran our own wings, we had our own clothes. I'd been very much involved in the IRA prisoners education program, and then was in charge of it from 1987 to 89 as part of the camp staff. And it was around that time we started poetry workshops. Started the magazine, The Captive Voice, with Laura Gofa and Brian Campbell, who I want to collaborate with a lot of things with. Brian was appointed the editor of the magazine. The magazine continued for the next 11 years up until the prison closed. I actually wrote the last editorial for it. So there's really we had a motto about writing our own history, that other people will write it and might be very sympathetic, but we're the ones who know it ourselves, like what we're living through. And that was all an evolution from very academic education, political education, about the world struggles, and the whole thing was geared around, how can volunteers go back out of the prison and play a very active role in the struggle, either militarily or politically. And the best way was to educate ourselves that way, not educating as in qualifications, but as in being conscious of things and ability. And I think ex-prisoners have played that vital role. They had an experience of debating on one thing and another, and found it easier, I think, on the outside to take on very different opinions and not get totally agitated, or most of them anyway. So I'd already been involved in it, and I mean, the whole purpose for doing the PhD was I wanted to write a book about the change in IRA prisoners' politics in the jail over the course of the jail from it opened in 72. Which would have been a very conservative Catholic, people like Billy McKeon, and no offense, man, but I mean, people from that generation were very, it was like anti-Marxist. There was a time some books were burnt because they were seen as communist. that started to change anyway in the cages, but it certainly changed in the blocks. There was none of that. So it moved from a very hierarchical type of command structures to ones that were more centralized and more just getting rid of a lot of very militaristic type things. But also the politics had changed. And I thought it was an important thing for Republicans to know, because probably most wouldn't. They hadn't been in jail. And I was having a conversation one night with Mike Tomlinson, who's a lecturer at Queen's University. And that's often happens, when you're having a pint. This was in Madden's, with the ideas going. I said, I'm not writing this book. And he says, well, why can you do a PhD and then you have a qualification as well as that there? And I just didn't know beforehand you could do that. So that's where the PhD came out of. It was called Unrepentant Fenian Bastards, because it was like a way I thought of, when you put unrepentant in front of the other, it totally changes it. But my motivation was...
It's taking ownership of the term.
Taking ownership, yeah. I can never understand why people thought Fenians was a derogatory term anyway, because we would have looked at people like the Fenians and other revolutionary Irish.
Alex Milligan, the Fenians will get you.
Yeah. So it was grown out of that wish to tell our story, write our own history. And then that developed my own personal history as well. We wrote the book, Nor Meekly Serve My Time, which has been thankfully reprinted again this year by Mike Tomlinson and Bill Ralston, who are the people behind Beyond the Pale books. And great to see that they're back in business again. So the whole thing was about getting our history out. So I was really involved with that in the jail, both on a collective sense and also on a personal sense.
So that's a resource for the academic community, for historians as well.
Pardon?
That's a resource for historians.
Oh, yes, it is. I love the fact that my thesis sits on the shelves of Queen's University. And it's been interesting since. Even this year, if you look at the books, like Charles McKeown, his book out now, 6,000 Days, where he's talking about not just the protest, but his period in jail. Pat McGee, who was in prison in England and then over in the north. Tony O'Hara. And so it's to me, the more books, the more that people talk about it. Because if you do look back that period, the ones who were going to be commenting on the hunger strike were academics who probably mostly weren't involved in it, and certainly not in any intimate way. So to have people who are actually involved in it, write about it, and then be able to speak about it and get a qualification about it, to show that so it's just not a yarn. It's academically it has to come up to standards. And it's not for anybody, no matter what side they come from or what politics they come from. But it's great that we're a richer society for the more that there is of that story. We get a more idea of a more complex things. Things aren't as black and white,
Well, we're out of time now. We've been listening to Laurence McKeown talk about a period of Irish history, which is 40 years old this year, but you've brought it to life again for us. Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you, Martina.